Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House Podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. Mental health issues are widely discussed today, but these issues aren't new or just modern issues. 500 years ago, Martin Luther was sharing advice to people who were wrestling with similar mental issues and challenges that many of us face today. Our guest is Dr. Saunders. Dr. Saunders is the author of the new book, Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today. And he's going to unpack quite a bit about how what Luther said all those years ago has great relevance for us today. But before we get started with our conversation with Dr. Saunders, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your church for generations to come? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments that are tailored to each congregation's unique goals and needs. And now they'd like to help yours. Learn more at lcmsfoundation.org/podcast. Now on to our conversation with Dr. Saunders. Dr. Saunders, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're a new author with us for CPH. You've been researching and writing in the area of psychology and mental health for a long, long time. Tell our listeners a little bit about you and then what prompted you to take a deep dive into Martin Luther and his mental health advice?
Oh, sure. Most importantly, I'm a husband and a father, and even more importantly than either of those, I'm now a grandfather of four adorable young grandkids. They're just you always hear about the joy associated with that, but you really need to experience it to realize the validity of that. I grew up in St. Louis, attended college at Northwestern University in Evanston, met the woman who would become my future wife. Ruth Price was her name, and Ruth Price was, we were falling in love, but I was a fallen Catholic, and she wasn't going to have anything to do with that. Fallen Catholic, fallen Christian. And we, many hours of, never heated, but sometimes passionate debate about Christianity. And again, so the common phrase is former Catholics make the best Lutherans. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. I mean, Luther was a former Catholic. I knew the Bible and I knew Bible stories, especially the gospel stories, and just really kind of astonished. I fell away at about age 14. And by the time I was 20, I was being, pulled back practically unwillingly just by the logic and the sense and the consistency of what Ruth was telling me and what I was reading and what I was learning. So, so I joined the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we married and had our kids and had our lives together, and it's been absolutely wonderful. And, at Northwestern stayed at Northwestern, got my doctorate in clinical psychology. And one of the maybe few mental health professionals, clinical psychologists in Missouri Synod, which is, it's an interesting position. As I went along in my career, and again, my wife, Ruth, has many relatives that are brothers-in-law, who are pastors, and those pastors knew other pastors. And I would pretty regularly get phone calls from pastors who had heard of me. And they'd start with, hi, I'm so-and-so I know. And by the way, I have this parishioner. And I would end up, talking for an hour and a half with these pastors about what it sounded like their parishioners were experiencing: depression, anxiety, something even more serious than that, perhaps. about 10 years, 15 years of this, I thought to myself, I'm saying the same thing over and over again, and decided to write a book about what I was saying. It ended up being a 2-volume set published by Northwestern Publishing House, Wisconsin Lutheran, a Wisconsin Synod. And that, very boldly called A Christian Guide to Mental Illness. And while writing that, I came across some of what Luther was saying, what the evidence that we have about what Luther was writing to his loved ones, his friends, his, the prince of the local area, Emperor Charles, to his, the tutor of his children, colleagues of his. We have thousands of Luther's letters, and quite a few of them concern mental health. And, this fellow, Theodore Tappert, translated a lot of Luther's stuff. And Tappert, 50 years ago, collated a bunch of Luther's letters to people who are grieving, people who are under pressure, worldly pressure, to soldiers, and to the anxious and depressed. And so the letters had been sort of gathered for me, and I was looking at them again while I was writing this previous book, and I was just astonished at what Luther was saying to people. But what astonished me was what Luther was saying to people is the exact same thing that I tell my clients who I'm seeing who are depressed and anxious, and it's the exact same thing that I teach my students in our clinical program here to say to their clients. And Luther was saying it 500 years previous. And
well, I think it's interesting.
Go ahead.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people, when they hear Martin Luther and mental health advice, would almost think, what could he possibly have had to say 500 years ago that applies to us modern folks today?
Yeah.
And as you're going to unpack for us, it is very relevant and still very fresh, as is much of his writing.
Right. It was, and he's such an engaging writer too. That's one of the pleasures of writing this second book in particular, which was really about Martin Luther. It was such a pleasure to dive into his history and, again, read so many of his letters, not just letters like this. I thought about trying to write a book about Martin Luther's sense of humor, because so many of his letters are so funny. Some of them, though, are also quite, you could tell he's kind of in a bad mood when he's writing them. But his personality just shines through his letters, and how loving he was and how caring he was. But indeed, what did Luther have to say 500 years before the science of mental health really sort of took off in the mid-1900s, with Freud and Aaron Beck and with other mental health professionals. But Luther was way ahead of them. And I had an insight, and I think it's true, which is that, well, first of all, we know Luther himself said, I went through periods of depression myself. And in the book, I go through Luther's life, and some of the physical ailments that Luther had were just amazing. He was practically, it seems like, in constant pain with something or another, and it got worse as he got older. Turns out medical care wasn't that great back then, so there really wasn't much relief for him, but he believed in medical care. I think that's a really important thing for everyone to recognize. Luther sought medical care. He didn't like what they did to him, but he appreciated it. He often said, if this doesn't get better, I'm going to have to go see my physician, or I'm going to go to for physics, where we get physician from. But with regard, I think the insight that was most profound for me was, the Reformation. What Luther said that launched the Reformation is, we are misunderstanding what the Bible says. This is not actually what the Bible says. We are misguided in what we are saying to each other and what is being told us. And he applied that as well to how people think about themselves, about their relationship with other people, about their future, how they think about things that they have happened to them or that they've done wrong. And the most common thought that a person with depression might have, for example, is what I've done is unforgivable, or I'm unlovable, or even though my spouse and my 4 kids say that they love me, I don't believe them. So Luther recognized theologically, we need to recognize what the truth is. We need to embrace the truth, which is what is written in the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible. A lot of people are making mistakes when they read the Bible, when they try to understand the Bible, and we need to correct those mistakes. Mental health professionals nowadays, Luther had this insight himself about mental health problems, primarily depression, anxiety. People are often telling themselves the wrong thing. I'm going to make a fool of myself. What I've done is unforgivable. And just letter after letter after letter saying to people, beware your thinking. Beware of what you're thinking. Listen to others. Ask others what you're thinking and if it makes sense to them. And they will tell you, no, it doesn't make sense. And again, reading this as a mental health professional, it was so profoundly similar to what a mental health professional should do nowadays. And so the book is really inspired by that, but it's also, Luther wasn't a mental health professional. Luther was sort of a layperson when it came to mental health, and yet the advice he gave is advice really anyone can give. And that's a big part. Pastors, friends, anyone can give the type of advice that he gave, which is the inspiration for writing the book.
Well, and I think you're right. As you read through the book, and as I was reading through it, there are a lot of things that are just so practical for me and anyone who is dealing with human beings. And I think you're absolutely right. This will have a lot of practical impact for folks. Before we go too deep, let's how would you define the difference between mental problems and then this more serious mental illnesses? Because I think it is important that we know the difference, and there are some that would definitely require a professional's help. So help us with the definitions here of what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So we really want to consider mental health to be on a continuum. Some people have really good mental health. We call them mentally well. Probably most people have, most of the time, they are mentally well. They get stressed out, of course. They get sad, of course. They get anxious or upset about something, of course. But they return to general sense of contentment, maybe even happiness. They're able to enjoy the company of others. They're able to enjoy their grandkids or talking with their kids or spending time with their spouse and so forth. Able to do well at school or at work, at whatever roles they have that they're responsible for. And then at the other extreme are persons who have serious mental illness. Mental illnesses such as profound depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, schizophrenia, severe autism, and illnesses like that where persons are really incapable of sometimes even taking care of themselves, much less being in a job, attending school, doing well in life. Those persons with severe problems most certainly should see someone who has expertise in treating a mental illness. A person with schizophrenia needs to take medications, probably prescribed hopefully by a psychiatrist who is a mental health professional. Someone with severe depression should see probably a psychiatrist for medication, but maybe also a psychologist or a counselor to do therapy to help them clarify, or rather to correct the way they think about themselves and so forth. So, but there's a lot of people in between, people who aren't quite serious enough to have a diagnosis of, perhaps, let's talk about major depression. They're not so severe that they meet criteria for major depression. They don't quite cross that threshold, but they're right up against the threshold. And they're very distressed. And these are people that come to their friends. They go to their friends, they go to their pastor and say, I've just been really down about this situation. I've been looking for a job and I can't find one. I lost my job during the pandemic. I'm looking for a new one and I'm having difficulty with it. And I find that I'm not sleeping as well. They might not meet criteria for major depression, but they could certainly use some advice, some help. I'm at Marquette University. I'm sitting on campus right now. It's September. It's pretty early in the semester. Think about, it's really easy to imagine there's a lot of freshmen on campus here that are struggling to fit in because they're shy, because, leaving home, from leaving St. Louis to go to school in Milwaukee, leaving your friends behind, your family behind, mom and dad, brothers and sisters. And it's very, very exciting, but it's also sort of overwhelming. That type of person, we wouldn't say they have a mental illness because they're lonely and they're shy, but we would say they're struggling with a mental health related issue, and they could certainly use someone's kind advice, which again is, if they had written to Luther would have written back with some of his advice. But again, to repeat from earlier, if it was serious enough, Luther would have said to the person, don't be foolish, go to a physician. And I think that's very important advice for us too. So we need to be discerning when we're meeting with someone. This sounds pretty serious. You should probably go see a doctor, a psychologist, a mental health professional. Versus, this is something that it's certainly a problem, but it doesn't quite meet the seriousness criteria for being a diagnosable mental illness.
You write in the book that we shouldn't be surprised that there are people in our congregations who are challenged with mental issues, mental problems. How prevalent are these? And I guess on the flip side of the question is, why is it often so hard for us to talk about these in order to get the help that we may need, or just the advice that we might need to pull ourselves out of our heads?
Those are, again, wonderful questions. The prevalence of diagnosable mental illnesses is about 1 in 5 persons in any given year. Over the course of a lifetime, about 1 in 3, maybe as many as 40% of persons will experience a diagnosable mental illness. There's probably twice as many, double that number with regard to persons who approach mental illness. They have a mental health problem, which could certainly use some assistance, at least a kind conversation or two with friends or with the pastor or with the deaconess. So it's quite a few. A small congregation of 100. In any given year, 20 people in that small congregation will experience a diagnosable mental illness. Now, a lot of these mental illnesses will go away on their own, but some don't. It's not another 20% every year. Some continue to have the problem. The problem is chronic. It doesn't go away. Especially it won't go away if they don't get help for it. But others do come out of it themselves. So given that and by the way, so again, just think about those numbers. It's impossible that if you know more than 10 people in your church that you don't know someone who has a mental illness. It's impossible that you don't know some parents of a child with mental illness, or a brother or a sister with mental illness, or a parent with mental illness. What I say to pastors is, if you don't know who in your congregation is struggling with a mental illness, that's because they haven't told you. They tell you about cancer, they tell you about heart disease, they tell you about when their parents or their child is in the hospital. They call you up right away. But they, for some reason, they don't tell you about their mental health problems or the mental health problems of their loved one. The question becomes, as you asked Elizabeth, why is that? Well, it's because of the mental illnesses are somehow special in how we think about them, and how we think about them tends to be fairly negatively. We have very profoundly stigmatizing attitudes towards mental illness. We think the person with mental illness, it's because the way they were raised, or a parent who has a child with mental illness, well, it must be your fault that your child has a mental illness. Neither of these is true. Or it's somehow we weren't strong enough. I like to joke that somehow you weren't fast enough to outrun this mental illness. Weren't strong enough, weren't fast enough, weren't brave enough. This is punishment from God. The most stigmatizing of all for Christians. And Martin Luther himself addressed this directly and condemned it as part of what we condemn as the theology of glory, is the notion that anyone experiencing a mental health problem or a mental illness, it's because they don't have sufficient faith, which violates all three articles of our confessions. Strong enough faith, well, faith comes, Article 3 says, faith comes from God. We're being punished for not having strong enough faith. Well, that violates Article 2. Christ paid for all of our sins. Somehow we're responsible. That violates Article 1. God's in charge. So this is the theology of glory, pure and simple. And what I tell pastors, deaconesses, teachers, anyone who will listen, is that you're likely not hearing the theology of glory at your church. I hope not anyway. But our society embraces the theology of glory. We get what we deserve. And if you truly do believe, a lot of Christian faiths have this very notion, and they talk about it. If you believe strong enough, you will not experience any pain. You will be happy. God wants you to be happy. That's nowhere in the Bible, by the way. God wants you to be happy is what Joel Osteen famously says. And so if you're not happy, if you're depressed, or your child is depressed, what am I to do except to condemn myself as being an inadequate Christian, not loved enough by God? And we don't do this with any other illness. We don't do this with any other illness. Imagine saying to someone with cancer, with heart disease, with diabetes, with profound autism, well, your faith clearly isn't strong enough. But this is sometimes what we do. And again, I don't think Lutheran Missouri Synod Lutherans are hearing that, but in the church, from the pulpit, but they're hearing it. And unless we address it directly from the pulpit in our church, they're going to fall prey to it. And they're going to question again, does God really love me? What am I doing wrong?
And I think in all of that, when we get inside of our heads, and I know I've been prone to do this, but especially if we're wrestling with something like a mental health problem, it's so easy to spiral just in our thoughts, and it's so hard to pull out of that, even if you recognize I'm talking myself into this, and I'm letting my thoughts drive this. It's hard enough to pull out then, but if you're not recognizing that your thoughts are taking you there and taking you deeper, what's some of the advice that Luther shared on our cognitive thinking and behavior that we can apply today as we're looking at this? Because and you've referenced thoughts and behaviors. What's some of his advice?
His advice was so loving and lovely and amusing. He said, you must compare the way you're thinking to, you must wrestle this. This is a ravening lion. Your thoughts are a ravening lion. You must realize that, and he often attributed them to the devil. This is the devil wanting you to think this way. So I would say the most basic advice Luther gave about thinking is the best advice that anyone can give about thinking, which is your thinking is often wrong. Just because you're thinking, it doesn't make it right. And the second advice, and so that, some will recognize the term that you use, cognitive. Cognitions is a fancy word for thinking. And we have one of the most powerful healthcare interventions ever invented is called cognitive therapy. A lot of people will have heard of cognitive behavior therapy. Well, Luther was a cognitive behavior therapist. He gave cognitive advice, but the other part of Luther's advice, which is really, really important as well, maybe even more important than beware your thinking, is don't be alone. Talk to others about what you're thinking. By the way, do fun things. There's so many paintings of Luther singing, and he apparently at table practically every night, entertaining guests and talking and talking and talking. He just loved the company of others. He loved his wife. He loved his kids. He loved his friends, and he hung out with them. And he tells his own story of, when the Pope was trying to kill him, and he was isolated, sequestered away, hidden away. And there were others at this castle, and Luther isolated himself. I think he was just kind of down about having to interfere with his life and, his enjoyment of his loved ones. He was separated from them, but there were others there. And he says, I made a mistake during this time, and it caused me to become very seriously depressed, but I isolated myself, and I shouldn't have done that. And you, Prince, he wrote this to several people. He told this story to several people. Don't do that. Don't do what I did. Go out in the company of others, enjoy yourself, but also talk with them and share with them what you're thinking, so that they can say to you, well, that's a foolish thing to think, or something like that. So, and I mean, any adult who's ever talked to a child probably has corrected, I bring my grandson to your house, and you have a really friendly doggy, and your doggy comes up to the grandson and he's scared and he cries. What do you say? What do I say? Don't be afraid. You're thinking this dog is dangerous and it's making you feel afraid, but look how friendly he is. We'll change your thinking. Look how friendly he is. He's a really friendly dog. Look at, he's wagging his tail. He's trying to lick you, trying to change the way the child thinks so that the child is less fearful. And that's a very, very basic, but probably practically a universal thing that adults have done with children about their fears. There's nothing for you to be afraid of. They're thinking that it's dangerous or scary. They're thinking it's dangerous, therefore they're scared. No, it's not dangerous. This is a really friendly doggy. This is, it's okay. So this is what Luther did with people as well.
I'm just thinking about the times I've done that with my sons, and you're talking yourself into being nervous about this scenario, or you're talking yourself into this anxiety. They don't always believe me, but after a while, with repetition.
Right. And that's a really important idea, though, too, which is that, therapy, I don't see someone once and correct their thinking and send them on their way. Our thinking does become habitual. Partly, as you said, we spend so much time with ourselves saying the same thing to ourselves, gnawing at that bone. I think that was an expression that that Luther used, gnawing at the same thought. And so it does take some effort on the part of the person, on the part of others, trying to convince them to have a different way of thinking. It's not necessarily easy, but it is, it's doable. And so, yeah.
Because we know that we're going to run into people in our circles who are struggling with something, whether they've told us this yet or not. It's important for us to know how to have a helpful conversation with them, and what do those helpful conversations look like, and what should the goals be for those?
A helpful conversation, we can probably start with maybe a definition of what a helpful conversation is, which is that someone comes to you in some distress and you help them feel at least a little bit less distressed. Oftentimes their distress, and this is again related to the stigma associated with mental health problems, which leads to really a lack of conversation. We don't talk much about mental health. I have a class of 35 students, and just yesterday I asked the class, how often did you talk about mental health when you were in high school? Raise your hand if that was a conversation that regularly happened in high school, and not one hand went up. What about nutrition? Every hand went up. What about phys ed? Every hand went up. But we don't talk about this most basic thing about ourselves, which is how we think and how we feel. It's the essence of who we are, and yet we don't talk about it. So a helpful conversation is someone comes to you in distress. You can probably assume that they're distressed and they're not sure why they're distressed. And they're feeling embarrassed about being distressed. So a helpful conversation would start there, which is helping them not be embarrassed, which is, which entails a couple of things. First, it's going to be at least 20 minutes, probably more like 30, maybe 40 minutes of a conversation. So if you can tell that someone really needs to talk, do yourself some grace and say, I can see this is important to you. Can we talk in another hour when I'm free? Because I want to spend enough time with you to do this. You probably want to do it in private, where they can feel free, feel less uncomfortable telling you what's going on. And then mostly just listen with compassion and share that, I can see, I can understand. If I were you, I can see why you feel this way. I can understand why you feel this way. If I were you, I'd feel the same way. And what you've done right there has been helpful, because you have attacked their sense of being weird or their sense of shame. Just being with them for a half an hour or 40 minutes, as opposed to saying, this is way too much for me. This is appalling. I'm so embarrassed for you. I need to leave. Just being with them is helpful. And so a helpful conversation is, a lot of listening and no judgment. And by the way, I think I'm describing everyone who's listening. You are a good listener, probably. Some of you aren't. Practice that. Try not to be judging, and be careful of giving advice. Wait till they say, do you have any advice? And probably they won't. We don't need to solve their problem. We don't need to give advice so that they can solve their problem by following our advice. Rather, five meetings later, a pastor wants to say, you know what, I think you should go see a therapist about this. Or a deaconess says, you know what you're saying, I'm not sure I agree with how you perceive yourself. Those are types of advice. But the most important thing, and the first thing, and anyone can do this, is just to listen and say, I understand. And is there anything I can do to help? And that itself will do a profound good, and they will be grateful.
There's so much that we could unpack, and I will encourage our listeners to go get this book because you'll find it very, very useful. As we wrap up, what piece of advice from the different pieces that Luther dispensed through his letters and over the course of conversations did you find the most useful, or that you would see you would tend to lean on the most as you're talking with friends and family and other folks who come to you wrestling with these challenges?
Well, just to be clear, I'm very cautious about giving advice to friends and family. But I think, but what I do is sort of similar to what I just talked about. And I think it's very good advice, is just to listen and to say, there but for luck, there for the grace of God, go I. You are no different how you're feeling. If I were you, this is how I would be feeling. What Luther said was, of course you feel this way. My favorite quote of Luther's is, he's writing to Melanchthon, and he says, I am well, but my weak faith torments me. Martin Luther, tormented by weak faith. Why did he say that? Mostly because it was true. His weak faith did torment him, but he wanted to reassure Philip, his friend, if you're worried about your weak faith, join the club. It's very natural. It's very normal. Likewise, you're sad, you're anxious, you're depressed, things are bothering you. If I were you, they'd be bothering me too. But be careful how you think about these things. Don't think too much. Ask others for how they view things, and just chock full of great advice. In one of the chapters, I end with his letters to his wife Katie. And those, if you want to read some really fun letters of Luther, and there's really good resources. You can find some online. Luther's letters, but some of his letters to Katie, actually, those are probably my favorite quotes. Writing to Katie, he addresses her as the mistress of the pigsty, because they were growing pigs, and she was so busy, taking care of the pigs and teasing her all the time, and writing her saying how much she missed her beer and her wine. So it was just, she was quite the force, apparently. But just some lovely letters that Luther wrote to his wife.
So for our listeners, the book is Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today. We'll link to this in the show notes, so I encourage you to go check it out. You won't be disappointed, and I think you'll learn quite a bit as you read through it, and even talk about it with friends and family. Dr. Saunders, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been wonderful.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Listeners, we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House Podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.